Hello, and welcome to our discussion with Stephen Tellis and Michael Lefebvre on the captured economy, how the powerful enrich themselves, slow down growth, and increase inequality. I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion, and I hope you are too. Please note the question and answers box in the lower right corner. I will be using it to grab questions to ask Steve and Michael. And note also that we will be giving away 5 copies of Stephen's book to give away to viewers at the end of the event. So stick around to the conclusion. And before we dig into the nasty business of capturing public policy, let me first introduce the president of the Mackinac Center, Joe Lehman. Joe started with the Mackinac Center in 1995 after our early leaders, Joe Overton and Larry Reed, convinced him to leave a good job with the Dow Chemical Company to work in a speculative free market think tank focused on state and local policy. He's been president since 2008 and has expanded the Mackinac Center into journalism, litigation, legislative outreach, and more. In addition to being the president of the Mackinac Center, he is also the vice chair of the National Taxpayers Union and member of the board of directors of the Atlas Network, which supports free market think tanks around the world. Joe, can you tell people what we've been up to at the Mackinac Center?
Yes, I can, and I want to thank all of the friends and supporters of the Mackinac Center for joining the show today. And the Mackinac Center has continued through now entering our second year of lockdowns and pandemics, and that means we are in court pursuing information and pursuing public information that the government has been withholding or has been unable to produce, and pursuing justice in the court. One of the things that we're looking for is, and we're having to sue the governor for this, is a release of data related to COVID deaths in nursing homes. And this is, of course, has made huge news around the country with the New York experience. Government policy there early on sent a lot of COVID patients to nursing homes. And of course, that now we know that allowed a quick and easy spread of the disease of the virus, which killed a lot of vulnerable people. What we are lacking in Michigan is good numbers that show exactly what similar policies in Michigan did in Michigan. So we'll be pursuing that and let you know how that turns out. Also, we're having a little trouble getting the University of Michigan and the governor again to release data that shows how they're modeling the effects of the pandemic and how that's affecting the governor's decisions and her agency's decisions to impose restrictions on society. And so we're asking the courts to resolve this question of why won't they release information that the public already owns and that the public has paid for. And at the U.S. Supreme Court, we've asked the U.S. Supreme Court to consider an appeal that we are bringing on behalf of airline and railway workers who are being forced to support a union, whether they want to do anything with a union or not. And you may recall that a decision called Janus at the U.S. Supreme Court back in 2018 said public sector workers can't be forced to support a union because it infringes on the free speech. It requires them to support speech that the union supports. And so we are asking the court to hear our argument that this should apply to the quasi-public unionized workers in highly regulated airlines and railroads. And since the Janus decision, the number of public sector union workers, the number of public sector workers who belong to a union dropped by about 14%. And that's $450 million a year that those workers get to keep, and that the unions cannot spend on speech or activity or anything else that the workers may disagree with. Now, we've released a report that was very timely, and you'll remember when it was colder. It even got cold in Michigan or down in Texas. They had some serious electricity grid failures, and that happened about a day before we released our report by my colleague Jason Hayes on how does Michigan's electricity grid actually work. And it just shows a framework. It is actually a good piece of think tank work that allows people to have a basic understanding of what is this infrastructure that we depend on and almost never think about, yet it's critically important. And it's a big part of the costs baked into everything made in Michigan and every activity that consumes energy in Michigan, which is just about everything. So that report's easily downloadable on our website. And again, the last time I did this show, I bragged that the Mackinac Center has been found in the top 4% of think tanks in North America, and we are the highest ranked think tank that focuses on a single state. So we're very, very proud of that. And we have one final piece of news to give to you today, that the Mackinac Center's satellite office in Lansing, of course, we're headquartered in Midland, but we have a satellite office in Lansing to make it easier to communicate with lawmakers. We have now moved our satellite office into a new Freedom Embassy in Lansing, patty corner from the Capitol building, and it is we've already been told by an association head that it is the best office in Lansing by far. And so we've got a great view of the Capitol. We'll be working there with other allies who want to advance free markets and educational choice and goals we all agree on. And we'll be even closer and having better access to policymakers there. So when it makes sense for us all to gather again, we can't wait to invite all of you to an open house there. James, that's it for now. And I want to thank Mackinac Center friends and supporters again for being with us during this pandemic and even longer.
Thank you, Joe. So now on to our main event, which is a subject near and dear to my heart. And so I'm excited to introduce Stephen Tellis, the co-author of the book that we're discussing today. He's the Associate Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University and Senior Fellow at the Mackinac Center, and he has written books on the conservative legal movement and how the right changed its tune on criminal justice issues. He is also one of the leading voices working to get cross-ideological forces to come together on public policy solutions. And our other panelist is Michael Lefebvre, the Senior Director of the Maury Fiscal Policy Initiative here at the Mackinac Center, where he's been researching and writing about state policy for the past 26 years. Some of his work includes estimating how many cigarettes are smuggled into each state in order to avoid cigarette taxes. He also shows that the state administrators are spending good taxpayer cash to mislead residents about the benefits of tourism spending. And he works to demonstrate that the state's economic development programs are more about protecting the jobs of politicians rather than growing the economy. So welcome our guests. Make sure to use that question and answers box, and we will get started. Steve, we should expect that there are some inefficiencies in government, right? Why do you think this problem of capturing public policy is a big deal, and why should voters care?
So first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I like one of the things I enjoy in my career most is talking to a broad range of different organizations. As you said before, one of the things that I'm sort of branded on is about thinking about what are the conditions under which you can actually get public policy made that brings different ideological and partisan sides together. So again, what we're talking about here today is rent seeking, and if you were an economist, you'd give a big fancy definition of that. But for our purposes, I think it really just means any case where government protection or subsidy ends up artificially increasing the profits of businesses or professionals above what they would get in a competitive market, right? And so we're going to talk about lots of examples of that, but that's really what we're addressing. And so the question is, well, why do we care, right? And we can often think about these things as well. Of course, obviously, people who are in businesses are always going to be there trying to get a little of advantage through government. So does this actually matter at all? And I think there's three reasons why we should think that it does. And I'm going to get into the magnitude of the problem a little bit more later. But the first thing I'll say is the scale of constraints on competition and subsidies for existing activity have very large effects on economic growth and innovation. So a lot of innovation comes through what Schumpeter famously called creative destruction, right? That is one of the sort of miracles of a market economy is we've figured out a more or less bloodless way to destroy power, right? I mean, that is businesses that have customers and everything, right? They've got real social power. Right? But one thing that markets do is we've found a way to allow those businesses, that structure of power that's making people wealthy, that's making them influential, to literally destroy them, right? That's what markets do all the time, right? They destroy incumbents and they make room for new people, and that's really the core source of economic growth and innovation, right? It's not that existing firms, just get better at what they're doing. It's that we have entirely new firms with entirely new business models, with entirely new products that come in. But a lot of rent seeking is what existing incumbents do to protect themselves from creative destruction. So I would say economists love creative destruction. Businesses generally don't. Businesses generally, they don't like the idea of creative destruction if they're in the crosshairs of it, right? But across multiple areas, that's where economic growth and innovation come from, and various forms of rent seeking slow that whole process down. It's like making the whole economy have to work through Jello, so the whole thing sort of is slowed down. The second, which we're going to talk about in even greater detail later, is inequality. Right? One thing that rent seeking generally does, right, is it protects incumbents, and incumbents generally are the people who succeeded yesterday, right? The people who are yesterday's winners can extend that their winning, even if they're not necessarily continuing to produce something of value to other people, right? They can, in that sense, lock in their social status and protect it against competition. You do that long enough, and what you're going to start seeing is more calcification at the top. You're going to see more and more of the people who are yesterday's winners also becoming tomorrow's winners, and yesterday's losers not having the same opportunity to become tomorrow's winners. You play that out long enough, and what you get is a much more rigidified, class-bound society, right? And I think that we're seeing a lot of that in ways I'm going to talk about later. But that kind of inequality is incredibly toxic, both for our politics and for the defensive markets. And the third thing I'll say is this has effects on the legitimacy of government, right? To the degree to which that is, we have lots of disagreements here, probably disagreements between me and the other people on this call about what the scope of government ought to be. But we all agree that government ought to be doing some things, right? And there's some things that it really needs to do well. And rent seeking generally eats away at that legitimacy of government. It eats away at people's faith that government is generally serving the larger public interest. And it increases the perception that government is simply a tool that insiders can use to protect themselves, that it's not really an instrument of the public good or the public weal. And that naturally produces populism. And when you think about the populism, both of the left and the right, of Bernie Sanders and of Donald Trump, right? All of it is based on the idea that there's a set of insiders who are using government to protect themselves, and therefore we need a kind of a force from outside to come and simply shake everything up or drain the swamp or whatever metaphor you want to use. But that kind of populism is rarely well tailored to the actual problems with governments and markets. It often turns into immigration restriction or trade protection or other kinds of things that in the process really actually just slow down markets rather than actually solve the underlying problem of rent seeking.
Mike, what are some state and local policies that you engage with that have been captured by rent seekers?
Well, there's a number of them. I've tended to focus on economic development and alcohol control, among others. One of the things that Stephen has mentioned is a lot of this from a federal perspective, but his book also takes a look at things at the state level as well. In fact, there's been a great deal of broad statistical research on the impact of rent seeking on state economies. One of my favorite pieces of scholarship comes from Harold Broom, who was once an economist at the General Accountability Office in Washington, D.C., and he wanted to explore this relationship between the degree to which rent seeking occurs in state capitals and the impact it has on state economies. And after looking at this, he found that states that engage or encourage rent seeking in their state capitals tend to have rates of real economic growth that are much slower than those that have less. And he researched this by collecting data across 48 state capitals across 10 years, involving government employment at the state level, the number of lawyers there were at the state capitol, the number of registered lobbyists. And he warned people that the more of this activity that occurs, the slower the rate of economic growth. Now, that has important implications because there are departments in Michigan and elsewhere that actually hang out sort of a rent seeker's dinner bell and yell, "Come and get it." Ironically, Michigan has the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, which is charged with creating good jobs and keeping others around. And their very activity, the encouraging of rent seeking, might actually retard growth, economic growth, and work against their own mission. Of course, Steve mentions this in his book too. At the state level, we have occupational licensure. This is an opportunity for those within a licensing regime to collect artificial rents or pay higher than they might otherwise receive. It comes at a cost not only to consumers, but even within the regime, there's a degree of economic inequality. Research shows and appears in a Mackinac Center report that percentage gains from rents to licensing for people on the lower end of the spectrum aren't as large as those as you climb the distributional income, say from going from a manicurist to an electrician.
Steve, as you mentioned in your previous question, you said this kind of rent seeking increases income inequality. What's your best case for why people on the right should care more about income inequality?
This is that traditionally conservatives had thought it was their job to defend the distribution of income. So if you go back when I was a boy and in college, I read Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia that a lot of conservatives read. And a lot of that book was a defense of inequality, right? About why inequality was naturally produced by markets, that it was the government's job to protect it. A lot of that, the history of conservatism is defenses of inequality. And the argument was usually that markets are great and generate benefits for everybody. And the returns that people get from markets are a result of the benefits from exchange. That is, the higher incomes of wealthier people are just the rewards for producing things that people value. So defending markets also therefore meant defending inequality. But interestingly, at the same time, conservatives have devoted a lot of energy to denouncing the pervasiveness of government intervention in the economy. But that suggests that our economy is not, in fact, best described as characterized as pervasively market-oriented. Consequently, we should not assume that the distribution of income is necessarily just. It may just be that a lot of the income at the very top is what we might call ill-gotten gains rather than the just reward for risk-taking or hard work. And I describe this as sort of the conservative paradox of income inequality, right? That is, in some ways, what conservatives are defending is the inequality of income in a government that doesn't actually look like the one we have, right? That is, they're describing that it would be just to have income inequality in in some other society. But the real question we have is the inequality we have in this society just, right? And this is clearest when you look at who is in the very top of the income distribution, especially the very, very top. There you'll see a lot of people in finance, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later, which I'll discuss later, but is pervasively regulated and structuring by government, including a ton of income from trading government debt, which is not exactly what most conservatives would want in their perfect society, right? Or look at entertainment or technology, much of which rests on supercharged returns from intellectual property, which in fact is a misnomer. It's a government-created monopoly. Or note that further down, there are a lot of doctors whose income in the United States, especially for specialists, are much higher than other advanced countries, and the whole field is characterized by barriers to entry and artificially swollen compensation. Or more obscurely, you see in the top 1% a whole lot of car dealers. And in almost every state in the union, car dealers are protected by state franchising laws. Even occupations like undertakers are quite severely protected from competition. And of course, land use in the United States is pervasively regulated through zoning and a huge mass of other regulations, which means that returns in the sector often reflect the excess profits developers get from access to political decision making rather than just the fact that they're producing wonderful products that people like. And the point is that conservatives in particular should not assume that the distribution of income in the United States reflects a natural market order of any kind. I could multiply other examples of the kind above, but once you start to add them up, they cease to look like an obscure exemption to a generally market rule. They start to look like the rule itself. Now, one implication of this is that we should have much higher taxes on income and wealth to claw back some of those ill-gotten gains. And I have to admit that as a somewhat oddball liberal, I'm kind of sympathetic to that argument. But where I'm aligned with market-oriented conservatives like those at Mackinac is that I think we should start by purifying our market order first. For one, there's just way too much inequality generated by these kinds of constraints on markets for government to compensate through redistribution. In addition, both as a matter of justice and efficiency, we really ought to treat these different kinds of high-end inequality differently. And so finally, I'll say, I think conservatives should care about this stuff because the pervasiveness of rent-seeking really delegitimates markets overall. It's very hard to make the argument against redistribution or regulation of various sorts if big swaths of the wealthy are getting rich by exploiting their access to government. That's a battle you lose. It's just really hard to make the argument that working class people should be subject to the full gale of international trade competition if doctors and lawyers and others are able to protect themselves through occupational license.
Viewers, use that question and answer box to respond to his pitch about why you should care, and especially if you have anything, any follow-up questions that you might want, and you'll respond to how persuasive he was. But we're going to stick on the subject, and Mike, how do the policies you deal with drive income inequality?
Great question, James, and it gives me a great opportunity. Stephen's last remarks give me a great opportunity to talk about that in greater detail, especially with regard to franchise-type laws. Many people in Michigan may not realize that if they want to consume beer or wine, the alcohol that they consume actually has to pass through 3 tiers. It goes from manufacturing, typically to a wholesaler, and then to a retailer before being purchased by an individual. In Michigan, as in other states, we have this 3-tier system. And in the middle tier, there's a group of wholesalers, only about 90 of them left in Michigan, that have an exclusive franchise territory through which they can sell their brands alone. So if you have a Miller distribution in a particular area, they're the only ones who can sell it. This one advantage that has been carved out in law for just a handful of wholesalers, very protective carve-out, has been studied. And back in the early 90s, it was estimated that this artificially increased the cost of just one thing we consume, alcohol, by 7%. And a lot of that is simply a transfer from Joe Sixpack to the wholesaling class, just a handful of people, as a result of political activities rather than market activities.
Six-pack.
Joe Sixpack. You know, Budweiser cannot deliver their product directly to Sid's Party Store in Midland. They must sell to the wholesaler. And to give you an anecdotal idea of how much money is at stake with this just one area of Michigan consumption and law, years ago, before Delta absorbed Northwest Airlines got busted effectively smuggling their own beer and wine into metro airports so they would not have to pay tribute effectively to the local wholesaler. They reported when they had gotten caught that they were saving $3 million a year by doing so. Now multiply this experience by 1,000 or thousands of Michigan businesses that engage in this trade with beer or wine, or the consumers, and you can see how money is shifted thanks to law and protections in the law from lower income people into higher income, even elite people. Stephen's right, it delegitimizes legitimate market gains when people look at a group of wholesalers who have advantages built into the law for them. And by the way, this is just one advantage. Parts of the Alcohol Control Code look as though the wholesalers actually wrote their own law. It provides not only protection, but seems to drive business to them. Another quick example in that vein is post and hold rules. People may not realize this, but the law mandates that manufacturers and wholesalers publicly post the prices they're going to charge for their products and then hold those prices in place for a length of time, depending on whether or not they're beer or wine. This is designed to serve as a price suppressing mechanism. Estimates are that this law alone, nationwide, where their states have these laws, raised the cost of beer and wine to consumers by 6 to 30%. These price increases mostly accrue to these beer and wine wholesalers, and that's just one field. There are others. Corporate welfare I've worked on a lot. One program in Michigan history offered up something like $14 billion in revenue in gifts, tax credits, refundable tax credits, subsidies to a relative handful of corporations, many of whom are very large and have well-heeled shareholders who can benefit from them. James, if I'm not running out of time, one more quick point.
Go for it, Mike.
To give you an idea of how pervasive the problem is, how almost insidious and incestuous it is, there was a think tank in North Carolina that intercepted a PowerPoint presentation made by Ernst & Young incentives department leader and another to corporate lobbyists. And they named their presentation, Turning Your State Government Relations Department from a Money Pit into a Cash Cow. And the entire lecture was designed to teach lobbyists how to get something for nothing from or little from their local governments or state governments. I've seen this happen in person. The Michigan Economic Development Corporation lost one of its employees to Ernst & Young, and then Ernst & Young sent them right back to the MEDC to lobby for incentive favors for their clients. They viewed themselves as one big happy family, not skeptical opponents.
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up on this one on just a recent bill that we passed, I think in 2017. I mean, if we're talking about income inequality, we have one person who's the wealthiest person in the state of Michigan, and we rewrote a policy so that taxpayers pay for a chunk of the building that he was going to build. I mean, that's got an effect. But let's follow up with Linda's question in her Q&A, Mike, and I wanted to see if you could deal with this one because Steve answered this one before, but rent-seeking is a technical term. Most people haven't heard of it unless you deal with public policy and economics. And you take another stab at helping to define what rent-seeking is and means.
It's favor-seeking. It's going to government in the attempt to collect higher than normal returns or rents on your investment. The technical term that Steve was afraid an economist might use is payment to a factor above what would be necessary to keep that factor employed in its present use. In short, it's lawyers and lobbyists and businesses and contractors going to the government to obtain either protection in the form of from competition or actual subsidies, for instance, or protection in terms of your career by lobbying to have it require a license and thus excluding competition. We have seen in the state of Michigan, home decorators try to get a licensing regime imposed on themselves so they could exclude others and raise their price. You know, there's nothing more dangerous in the world than bad feng shui. And thank heavens some governments protect us from it.
Yeah, and Linda, if you're interested in some more information about this one, I think that's one of our questions for our old Ask the Economist feature at the Mackinac Center. So check it out at mackinac.org. But let's get back to the subject. Steve, in your book, you say that your recommendations on finance would result in a smaller but more robust financial sector. What do you think this would mean for a typical resident here in Michigan?
Thanks. And again, I would say it's important to sort of recognize that rent seeking affects the distribution of income all the way along the distribution, right? So some things we're talking about are what I would refer to as the sturdy yeomanry of the 1%. Those are your doctors and car dealers, although some of the car dealers can be very large and get very large returns out of protection, right? And then there's the superstars of rent seeking, right? So Taylor Swift, I'll just, I like a lot about Taylor Swift, right? But the fact that that the entertainment industry has captured intellectual property allows her to magnify her income by creating these incredibly strong intellectual property rules, which increasingly are now being exported to the whole rest of the world. But definitely the superstars of rent seeking is finance, right? And I'd say that the pervasiveness of the financialization of the economy has a number of effects, and I'll go through just a few, but I just want to see if you can put up this one chart which shows you the size of the financial industry as a function of, oh, is that the wrong one? I think you got the wrong. It just shows you the growth of the financial sector as a percentage of the overall American economy. At some point, hopefully, we'll have that up. And one thing we've seen is a pretty remarkable shift of the American economy and finance. There you can go, right? So you can see that from after World War II until the 1980s, it was sort of gradually moving up, and to some degree, an increase in finance is a predictable feature of an increasingly market economy, and a little bit more finance actually turns out to be correlated with economic growth because finance up to a point helps to allocate capital efficiently over the larger economy. But then starting in 1980, you see this kink, and it sort of keeps moving radically upward to the point where it really doubles as a share of the overall economy. And this, I would argue, again, is not a spontaneous market response. It's a result of a range of government policies. One is that the government massively encouraged the growth of securitized finance. Those are the mortgage-backed bonds that many of you remember from the financial crisis. And a lot of what the financial sector is doing is trading those bonds which the government encouraged the creation of. In addition, we've had a large increase in government debt, and finance has also grown rich on trading government bonds. Next, the government encouraged a shift from employer pensions to 401ks and IRAs, which generate very large, and it turns out from economic research, entirely valueless asset management income to mutual fund managers. And as we know, the recurrent bailouts of the financial sector encourage a growth in risky trading, and I could go on, but the point is that the size of the financial sector is largely a function of government policy. So how does that impact places like Michigan? Well, I'll suggest just a couple of mechanisms. One is think about the banking sector back in the 60s and 70s. Some of the people on this call may remember what the world looked like that. It was dominated by savings and loans. Now, that, of course, wasn't a spontaneous market feature either. That was a creation of government policy. But what it meant was that most of the home loans in the country were being made and held on the books of savings and loans all over the country, including ones that probably are very close to you in Michigan. And this was a pretty good business to be in, and it generated what people used to call the 3-6-3 rule, that bankers took in deposits at 3%, loaned them out at 6%, and were on the golf course by 3 p.m. Now, what that generated was a very widely distributed number of modestly affluent bankers who paid a lot in country club dues all over the states of this country. Now that business, but the S&L industry, some of you may remember, blew up in the 1980s, and what replaced it was mortgage-backed securities. That business was very concentrated in New York and a few other mostly coastal cities, and so were the profits. And one effect of that is that the talented graduates of Michigan universities increasingly looked to moving to the coastal financial centers rather than moving up through the bank where they grew up. And this shift in the larger growth of finance, which is not at all geographically distributed, has created a huge sucking force to a small number of big winter cities. Again, this is not something that markets produce on their own. This was a function of the fact of how we decided to subsidize and regulate finance. And I could go on, but the general effect of rent seeking, especially the high end in finance and intellectual property, has the effect of artificially drawing economic activity toward a very small number of superstar cities and drawing it away from the more distributed economic activity that we would expect from a market economy.
That's interesting, especially since out-migration has been a problem here in Michigan, especially during the 2000s. We've gotten a little bit better, but we still lose people, as Mike Lefebvre knows. Mike, can you share some of the reactions you've had from both supporters and opponents of captured public policy?
Absolutely. Over time, we have seen reactions change. In the 1990s, it wasn't quite the way it ended up being in the 2000s. And it also depended on whether you were discussing policy at the federal and at the state level. In the early 90s, while this was a problem, it had not grown in magnitude to a great degree. At the time, Governor Engler, who was Senate Majority Leader, opposed the type of rent-seeking activities we're talking about in large degree, became a proponent of some programs that facilitated rent-seeking. Corporate welfare is, of course, a great example. Originally, the legislature scoffed at his idea of handing out tax incentives, refundable tax incentives, to corporations, and it resulted in one of his first losses legislatively. But he regrouped and then got this passed. And as Michigan's economy got worse, Lansing politicians on both sides of the aisle looked to these corporate handout programs as a way to buy themselves press release about jobs. They were creating job announcements, but not necessarily real jobs. So when the Mackinac Center started weighing in with pointed criticism, at first they tried just to ignore us. But when they realized we weren't going away, they relied on belittling us, calling us names, saying we have our head in the sand and live in an ivory tower, all the things you could hurl at us. But then over time, we started winning lawmakers to our side simply through the education process by pointing out case studies and empirical evidence to show that these programs were ineffective. In fact, over time, the Michigan Economic Growth Authority program that we pointed out and that Governor Engler passed back in the 90s, 6 studies have been done on the program's performance, and 5 of them have shown to have that the program had a 0 to negative impact. The MEDC, Michigan Economic Development Corporation, also reacted very negatively, and they did so in a way in response to our criticism by limiting the amount of information that they would allow the public to have. I actually had to have an act of the legislature really to get them to answer questions of mine. And when they did, when they were finally forced to, many of the claims they've made about job creation fell apart. We've seen this outside of corporate welfare as well. The Mackinac Center actually had to file a lawsuit against the state regarding holding back data on its alcohol control and post and hold data that we wanted to analyze. The good news is, over time, I think our education effort has had an effect. Years ago, when the state wanted to pass the film incentive program to subsidize film production in Michigan, there was only one vote in the entire legislature against the creation of this program. After it had wasted $500 million and had only a few more jobs to show for it in Michigan after these years of spending, the opposition to it was much more bipartisan. And even though people tried to bring it back, they still haven't succeeded in doing so. Another example, of course, is the Good Jobs for Michigan program. This was a brief pilot program that lasted 2 years. It was designed to let corporations keep the income taxes that their new employees would otherwise pay to the government. It's a real inequity story there too, but it was also something that demonstrated lawmakers could be persuaded these programs didn't work. They let it sunset, and then attempts to bring it back failed a couple of times. So we've made progress, and supporters and opponents alike, I think, respect the evidence a lot more than they used to.
Yeah, I mean, there's still a lot of captured policy that's out there. It's still crazy to me that Ford, GM, and Stellantis collect hundreds of millions of dollars from state taxpayers every year, and we're not allowed to be told how much they're collecting. There are some bills that are out there. I hope they get a hearing this year, but it's impressive just how much rent seekers can capture a particular area of policy.
Yeah, can I say something just for 30 seconds about that?
Oh, please go for it.
Inequality, one of the forms of inequality is between firms, right? That generally large firms are in a much better position to be able to lobby for protection or subsidy or other things, whereas small firms generally are not. And so I know a lot of people are worried about the increasing concentration of economic activity in the United States. And I think actually this pervasive rent seeking helps explain it, because one of the big things that existing large firms want is they want to use their profits to recycle back into government to protect themselves from competition from smaller firms. And so I think it's both this affects both inequality of income, but it also impacts inequality in terms of firm size.
Mm-hmm. Mike, can you share an example of where bipartisan support has shifted and why that happened?
Well, again, you can go back to corporate welfare. I gave the film incentives as one example, but since that time, we've seen economic development reform packages be introduced that would provide far more transparency than they currently do. They would mandate that the state announce the deals of an incentive package before it's actually signed into law. That way, Michigan can avoid, say, a Foxconn experience where the taxpayers of Wisconsin didn't learn how much they'd be on the hook to this corporation for until after the deal was struck. This gives people a chance to review the details and weigh in whether or not they oppose it or support it earlier than when the deal's already been signed. The good news is it's really this package of transparency and accountability was introduced by a who's who of bipartisan players in Lansing. It's a great example of how the opportunities can shift over time with the right education and the right people in office.
Yeah, and if listeners are interested in, or viewers are interested in that, check us out at the Mackinac Center. We're hoping that these bills get serious consideration in the legislature this year. But that's a good question to end on, which is how optimistic are both of you that we can change the politics of rent seeking and score victories against it?
I'm not super optimistic because the underlying political dynamics for rent seeking are extremely powerful, right? This really is a fundamental disease of democratic government, and it's in that sense it's not an accident. Now, in some ways, I would actually argue that political polarization, which we often complain about, may actually be a good thing for opposition to rent seeking, because typically rent seekers look for bipartisan coalitions or simply bipartisan disinterest. One thing that polarization ensures is, at least on some of these issues, one party is going to have a fairly persistent interest in taking a jaundiced look at occupational licensing of doctors or zoning rules that make it hard to build dense housing. But overall, I'm a little pessimistic, in part because I do think that polarization is not very good for opposition to rent seeking. In general, it's typically the case that anti-rent seeking coalitions are almost always bipartisan coalitions, because the opposition to them is generally transpartisan. It depends on liberal and conservatives having problems with these policies for often quite different reasons. And there's a coalition, and so if you think about the stuff that that Mike was talking about firm-specific tax subsidies, liberals generally don't like it because they think it sucks away resources from public services, and conservatives don't like it because they think it distorts economic activity and moves economic activity to places that are less efficient. But usually, in order to put together a coalition against the various different interests who've bought political support in legislatures or simply have convinced people that these forms of rent seeking are good public policy, you usually need a coalition across parties. Now, the problem, of course, is that these kind of coalitions are increasingly blocked by, on the one hand, the generally high level of emotional animus toward the other party, right? And that has only gone up in the last decade or two, and that makes it harder for legislators to imagine actually working together, especially over a long period of time, with the other party. And that's also stopped by increasingly strong agenda control by the majority party, which is not just true in Congress, but is often true in state legislatures, in which the majority only allows onto the agenda issues where they're highly cohesive and in disagreement with the other party. But doing something really pervasive about rent seeking requires that we create a politics in which regular, persistent cross-party coalitions can form, especially given that doing anything about most of these forms of rent seeking requires taking multiple bites of the apple. I think, as Mike will be able to tell you, in none of these areas are you just going to get one big win that's going to lead to the rapture and then everything's going to be wonderful, right? It involves persistently year after year after year trying to cut away at things. And the other thing I'd emphasize is that most of these anti-rent seeking efforts are highly underfinanced. It's just the case that the thing that really gets highly ideological people, whether they're on the left or right, really wound up in order to give them money to think tanks or interest groups is not this stuff. But working on these issues really demands a lot of shoe leather over a very long time. The other side on these issues, again, you mentioned some of them, have massive resources in protecting their arrangement. If you think about, again, just go back to the liquor example, the people who are sort of the middlemen in that industry literally know that they only exist as a function of government policy, right? Or if you think about the car dealers protected by franchising rules, right? That is, they literally only exist as opposed to being divisions of larger car companies in many cases because the government is giving them protection. Now, the good news is in many of these cases, you don't have to match what the insiders have, but these organizations that are fighting rent seeking really do need to have enough resources just to play. And the last thing I'll say is, I'll just say at the Mackinac Center, where I'm a senior fellow, we really have found it's difficult to find donors for work in rent seeking as compared to other areas we work in. But I think from the point of view of a donor with some marginal money to invest in accord with their principles, this is about the highest return on investment kind of activity you can engage in. So I'd say my optimism comes in part from the fact that I think intelligent donors will come around to the fact and will generate more organizational activity. And that absence of organizational activity really is the most important feature explaining why so many of these rent-seeking arrangements tend to persist.
Mike, how about you?
Well, on the one hand, I recognize that Willie Sutton, the famous bank robbers line, they asked him, why do you rob banks? And he said, well, that's where the money is. So one of the problems we face is that as long as there's money located in political capitals around the world, there's going to be hordes of lawyers and lobbyists and others trying to get some of that favor seeking, the rent seeking. And so the price of liberty will be eternal vigilance on this front, and it has been. But good news. As part of the outgrowth of the study of the political economy, economists have developed, constitutional solutions, restraints that they can impose on government at various levels to limit the degree of rent seeking. One of my favorite and very topical subjects right now is that of state compacts, getting states to sort of leap together on the same subject, so no one has to hold out and leap separately, only to be found, only to be on the losing end of some corporate jobs grab from your state. I'm speaking specifically of getting state leaders to sign on to a compact that says once we've reached a certain number of states, we will all avoid corporate handouts. These are the types of constitutional solutions and restraints that I'm looking to, and that I've seen a lot of bipartisan support on. The head of Good Jobs for Michigan out of Washington is terrific. He runs a progressive institution, and he likes to joke. He said, look, let's just get rid of this bad policy now, and progressives and libertarians or free market people can fight over what to do with the savings later.
I like that. Persistence, bipartisanship. I think just having a persuasive case. I think if we change the climate of popular opinion on this issue, we can have an effect, as we've seen in some of our work here in Michigan. But we're going to go on to questions and answers. Oh, Steve, did you have something?
Yeah, I'll just say, I think this is actually an interesting general question about whether is it the climate of public opinion that matters, or is it the actual information that legislators have? And so this is maybe a long-term, conflict. Sort of the Niskanen theory of the case is that what really matters is the information that legislators have, right? That is, are they presented with sufficient information to understand the actual pattern of benefits here? And is somebody actually presenting them with solutions that they have some reasonable reason to believe will actually be effective, right? I'm a little skeptical that you're ever going to get the mass public to really understand or mobilize on these issues. But this is why actually I think good think tank work matters so much on this, because literally that sort of elbow to elbow work with legislators explaining how these things work, explaining that there are alternatives that will actually have positive effects on jobs, matter a lot. You don't actually have to change everybody's opinion in order to get change in public policy in many of these areas.
Mike, do you want to respond to that one? Because you have had some experience of working elbow to elbow with legislators trying to get them to react to our work.
Not only with legislators, but with research about how the general public views these incentives. I have time and again had lawmakers tell me, all of that's great, but I have these 8 corporations down I-75 in my district. And so what they're thinking about is their own self-interest, not so much the scholarship that I'm bringing to the table. They appreciate it. They might actually reference it. Some will definitely use it. But at the end of the day, their self-interest drives their willingness to vote for this legislation. After all, a $200 million subsidy might cost people less on a per capita terms than it will cost individuals to call and complain about that subsidy to that particular corporation. Also, real quick, there's research been done out of University of Texas at Austin. I think Nathan Jensen did it. And he tried to measure reactions of the general public, specifically the median voter, to the price tags of corporate welfare deals. And what he found was the price tag didn't matter if you just talked about the corporate deal. $14 billion to Amazon doesn't resonate with the median voter. But saying this money could otherwise be spent on roads and bridges and police and schools gets their attention and leads them to change the way they might vote for a particular candidate.
Our last question comes from our viewers, and I like this question. I'm interested to see how you respond. Isn't rent seeking really a form of protection dues that was used very effectively by the mafia in the 30s?
Yeah, I mean, it can result in protective legislation, but I'm not sure that I would compare it to the illegal market.
Yeah, right. I mean, there always seems something a little criminal about some of these laws. When you have private companies writing public policy, it always seems a little suspect.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that in the stuff that Mike works on, and many of these firm-specific tax subsidies, and this is something Nate Jensen, who just got referred to, who is a senior fellow at the Mackinac Center, I'll just say. One thing he's shown is that these guys really don't want visibility, right? They desperately don't want exactly what these deals are made public. Certainly not public before they're actually announced. In some cases, not even public once they're already in place. And whether you call that criminal, I guess, is a matter of taste. But certainly a lot of these things are based on manipulation of visibility, right? The reason that many of these things survive is that they're done in very low visibility ways. So my favorite example I always use for my students is the North Carolina Dental Association, subject of a big Supreme Court case not that long ago. And in that state, people were doing teeth whitening in malls, and the Dental Association, basically, which controlled the North Carolina Dental Board, got the dental board, which was basically them, to declare that this was performing dentistry without a license. And I think one thing you see there is nobody shows up at the North Carolina Dental Board, right? There are no ordinary people who just happen to trip into the meetings of the North Carolina Dental Board. So at some point, they start treating this entity that actually has government power as if it's a private entity, right? And I think that's something that you see across many of these areas of rent seeking, right? Are areas where the government actually acting in its authoritative, often coercive form is not acting like a government entity, right? It's acting like a private association, but one that's armed with public power. And so, again, whether you call that criminal or not, that's your choice. But I definitely think that a lot of these things have this mixture of public and private, which is certainly, at the very least, not very good democratic practice.
Stephen and Mike, thank you very much for sharing your insight and experience with us. Thank you all for attending. I think we've covered a lot of ground. Also, congratulations to Linda Holloway, Tim Carlson, Warren Anderson, Luann Leroy, and Robert Reiner for winning a copy of Steve's book. Our events manager, Sandra Darland, will reach out to you via email to get delivery information. And if what we have discussed today resonates with you, please consider donating to the Mackinac Center. We are funded exclusively through private contributions, and I hope you consider supporting our work to make Michigan a freer, more prosperous state. Thank you, and we hope to see you next time.